But let's go a little bit more into this idea of balance. And let's talk about that dot we had at the very center. So obviously, like I said before, a dot or an object in the center of your composition feels like it's at rest. There's nothing acting on it. But if we were to shift it a little bit so that it's not quite on center, there's a sense of tension here, discomfort. There's potential energy here because it feels like this object should be in the center, like maybe it's on its way to the center, or maybe it's on its way to the outer edges. It's not quite at rest. It wants to go to center or go to farther out. In some ways, it's a lot more interesting than just being in the center because of that complexity, of that desire to move from one space to another. But it's a pattern that doesn't quite make sense. And because this dot is so close to the center, it's almost like this is accidental, like the artist didn't mean for it to be off-center, and because of that, it's creating a sense that this entire composition is accidental and has no meaning to it. So when you have a lack of balance or a lack of focal point, as I was saying before, it means that your message is being fuzzy. It's being lost. The player looks at it and the pattern doesn't make sense and quickly begins to look away. But let's talk about, let's move this a little bit farther out. Now, when at this stage right here, it's definitely not in the center. It's definitely not to the side. It's not in this sort of gray area that's kind of in between. It's sort of at this, if you've heard of the rule of thirds, it's kind of at the sort of third point here. So it still feels like an unbalanced composition, but it feels less accidental. It's on purpose. And if I was looking at a scene here where maybe there's a lot of complexity and this is my focal point, I feel like the composition isn't necessarily like forcing my eye on here. I'm discovering it inside of the composition. So there's a lot of more complexity and dynamicism to having it here. Moving out to the edge. So now that it's here on the edge, this feels a lot more like it's at rest, much like it was at the center. There are no necessarily forces acting on it. Maybe this is still fairly unbalanced, but it doesn't feel nearly as unbalanced as when we are here in the center or off center. And it doesn't feel nearly as off balance as if I were to sort of draw it up here. So this effect that we're looking at here is what Rudolf Arnheim talked about in his book, Art and Visual Perception, A Psychology of the Creative Eye, when he was talking about psychology and psychology and artistic composition, and how a shape, all shapes have what you could call a structural skeleton. So if we were to sort of divide this square in what is pretty natural, sort of a vertical and a horizontal here, and maybe let's divide diagonal. These sort of divisions, or sort of divisions of the overall object, are kind of converging here at sort of the center point, and we've got some side points in here. These are essentially the beginnings of the structural skeleton. We've got a dot here in the middle, points here on the side, points right there. And the structural skeleton it's kind of an interesting concept, but the general idea is that when there is visual weight that is placed at points on the structural skeleton, that weight is, I guess it has a lot more flexibility. Essentially, as if this is an object that we're looking sort of at a top down of, and these were the supports. These were the weight, where the weight can be placed without causing the object to sort of tip over. Now let's go ahead and start dividing this up a little bit more. So let's divide it in thirds, and here's sort of the very common idea of sort of the rule of thirds, and how sort of an image can be divided into thirds, and you have these points defined where weight can be placed. and it feels more or less balanced, or there's a lot more leniency in the balance. Let's divide it up into sixth, and now we're talking about a few more places right here. So if we were to erase all these lines and just kind of look at the dots, what this is essentially is kind of a description of where weight can be placed in this overall composition without feeling like it's overly unbalancing the composition. So if you put something pretty heavy here in the center, it doesn't matter if there's a lot of like sort of imbalance around it, because it's such a strong sort of balancing feature sort of in the center, or if we have a very strong sort of weight kind of on the third right here, we will still have to sort of like balance the image by probably putting some weight down here. But the fact that a lot of the weight is sort of on one of these sort of structural skeleton points means that we have more flexibility to work with. So to sort of illustrate that point, as you can see here, the balance of sort of this object and this object, the center of mass is somewhere kind of off right here, I think, and it is off center. It's an imbalanced sort of feeling. We sort of have this dynamic sort of tension, and this object is sort of like on kind of a sixth right here. It's not on the thirds. But if we were to bring the object here, so it actually is on the third. Now, this is, as you can see, the center of mass for these two objects is actually now even farther from the center. But despite that, there's a feeling like this image is actually more balanced than this image. There's more tension to this image versus here, because this object and this object, they are on structural skeleton, I guess, parts of the image. Now, this is all sort of psychology of breaking down a compositional image, but it's very real in how we sort of perceive the visual field. So we're going to return to this idea of structural skeleton later on, but it's just something I wanted to make sure that we got out there and talked about as far as talking about composition.